We're going to wrap up our look at the book of Nehemiah today. We've been glancing through, trying to discern some elements about the grace of God within the book of Nehemiah, and we have looked at a number of things in the course of this segment. The pain of grace, the prayer of grace, the person of grace in Nehemiah. What an outstanding person. His leadership just is motivated by the grace of God. The prompting of grace, the plan of grace, the purpose of grace, the persecution of grace, the paralysis. When the people lost sight of, when they began to complain, they lost sight of their work and the work stopped, and so grace was paralyzed for a while. And then we spent the last 3 lessons on the power of the grace of God that we found there. And this has just really been, for me, just a very revealing study. You know, there are times when I read things and I glean from them. There are other times when it's like, you can't go to your library and find a book on the grace of God in Nehemiah. So it's like you just say, okay, I'm going to look at this book, and God, just help me understand and help me see some things in here that relate to this. And so it's been really rewarding, especially for me, to study this book in that fashion, to watch this one man of grace be so devoted to his God that he actually influences an entire nation to become a people of grace. It's just phenomenal to even contemplate that kind of ability and leadership. To view people who were motivated to do God's work, to hear God's word, to submit to God's will, to be moved into the wonders of the joyful strength of God. It's just a marvelous book. It invigorates everyone who is a spiritual believer to look at this book of Nehemiah and how God's grace worked in that book. The book reveals the unique happenings of a grace-filled and grace-focused people. The book begins with a situation where there are broken walls as well as broken people. And Nehemiah is going to take care of both of those. He's going to be motivated by God's grace, working through his person to motivate the people. And now we've come to the point where the wall has been rebuilt. We're going to look today at the dedication of that wall and what took place in that. We have the walls restored and we have the people restored. And this is just such a great way to watch God's grace work. From physical destruction to spiritual restoration, and just witness that. The dedication is kind of a unique, and it's described in detail, and we won't take a lot of time to go into that, but reread the dedication here. We've got 2 choirs, and they start at different gates on the wall. They go up the wall, and they head towards each other, and all the while, they're giving thanks to God. They're just praising God for his goodness. And then they come together, they meet, they then assemble at the house of God, and there they are led by a choir director, and they begin again to offer up praise to God. And just imagine the sense of accomplishment, the sense of trusting God, that all of this has happened because of God's great strengthening in their lives. They've overcome the negativity. They've worked through the paralysis of condemning each other. They've mounted all of those difficulties, and now here they are praising God, singing praises and honoring God. Chapter 12, verse 43 says this, "And on that day they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, and the sounds of rejoicing in Jerusalem could be heard far away." These people were motivated. They were on top of the spiritual mountain. What a great ending. What a great ending. The sounds of the joy of these people echoing through the mountains around Jerusalem. The Lord had been the joy of their strength. And they were exuberating that joy. They were demonstrating that joy. As Governor Nehemiah has overseen the dedication, he has worked to get the wall rebuilt and the people reestablished. And he's going to, after working for a number of years there, he's going to return. Go back to Jerusalem, or go back to Babylon and serve the king. Everything's going just super well in Jerusalem when he leaves. There's only one problem. It's chapter 13. If the book ended in chapter 12, we would have just read the end of the book. But that's not where it ends. There's a 13th chapter. And in this time that Nehemiah has returned and he's gone back to Babylon, something goes backwards. And we're not told how long it was before he came back. We're not even told why he came back. I personally wonder, did he get another report? The first time he went was because he received a report from kinsmen about the condition of the place. I wonder if he wasn't staying on top of things and he got another report. We've got a wall, but we've got a people that they've lost their willingness. They've lost their spiritual heart. And so he decides to return. When he left, they were abounding in joy. Expectations were high, and spiritual focus, and everything was grace-filled. He returns to a very different place. Good intentions had faded into apathy, and apathy had deteriorated into atrophy. The people are right back where they were when the walls laid waste. They had a need for grace again. And this brings us to what I'm going to call the final issue of God's grace in the book of Nehemiah, and I'm going to call it this: the persistence of God's grace. The persistence of God's grace. You see, God's grace has to be persistent because you and I don't stay focused very long. Let's look at a couple of things that had happened here that indicate the spiritual decline in the city of Jerusalem. Number one, they'd forgotten who the enemy was. They'd forgotten who the enemy was. As we read through and we noticed all these different people raising objections to their building of the wall and how that rallied them together, and there were threats, personal threats that were made through the course of the book. And again, that became a rallying point because they could identify who the enemy was. They knew what the attitudes were that were destructive, and so they could rally around that. But one of the things that happened is that as they deteriorated spiritually was they forgot who the enemy was. And here is why I know that. Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah, had prepared a large room for him, where formerly they put the grain offerings, the frankincense and the utensils and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priest. Does that name Tobiah sound familiar to you? It ought to, because we've looked at him several times in the course of the book of Nehemiah. In chapter 2, he's the one that said, "What? If a fox were to jump on these walls, they would fall down." He's involved in ridiculing their work. In chapter 4, he actually is one also who is threatening to kill the Jews, and that chapter is where they decide to work with one hand and have weapons in the other. They devise the plan to rally to the trumpet blast if there is an attack. Tobiah is involved in that. And then in chapter 6, he actually is involved in a personal plot against the person of Nehemiah himself. So this guy has been an enemy. But now, because he has a relative who probably is serving as high priest, most scholars assume, he has cleared out a room at the side of the temple for this guy to set up his office in. Now, does that strike you as a little strange? Does that not seem like people had lost some of their focus, their spiritual focus, to take this man who was an enemy when they were in the process of doing God's work and to put him in God's house, to allow him to dwell there? The very one who threatened destruction and mayhem is now a part of everyday business in the temple. How soon they had forgotten. How soon they lost sight of who the enemy was. How soon that they stopped standing for what was right. And how soon they are in need of grace again because they forgot the enemy. Another sign of the spiritual deterioration, number 2, is this: they neglected promises that they had made. They neglected promises that they had made. They became comfortable with the enemy, and they also said, we just don't need to do this stuff that we promised we were going to do. Chapter 13, verses 10 and 12 says this, I also discovered, this is Nehemiah saying what he found as he went back. I also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given them. So the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. So I reprimanded the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? Then I gathered them together and restored them to their post. All Judah then brought the tithe of grain, wine, and oil to the storehouses. First of all, the people were neglecting their financial promises. You see, which came first? Tobiah in the storehouse, or the people forgetting their financial promises? Maybe it's a chicken-egg thing. Maybe the people forgot their promise, and so the room was empty, and so why not let Tobiah move in? Who knows? But the people began to neglect what they'd promised to do. They also had forgotten the sanctity of the Sabbath. They'd forgotten that day of rest. They'd forgotten the purpose that God had said, I'm going to give you my Sabbath. And in order for you to make it holy, I want you to not do all of these things. I want this to be a day that your focus is on me and that you have a restful heart. And the people were not doing that any longer. Chapter 13 says, in those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. Also men of Tyre were living there who imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Probably the number of us in this room who will remember when stores were not open on Sunday. You know, that number is getting fewer and fewer. But there was a time when merchants would not open their stores on Sundays. And it was out of a sense of respect for a spiritual day, so that that day could be honored. Isn't it interesting that much of what seems to have happened here is that it was the quest for money that led to the corruption of the Sabbath? The merchants wanting to sell more, have more influence that way. Early when they heard God's law about taking foreign wives, we find in Scripture that they committed themselves to avoid those dangers and those kinds of marriages. They made a promise, but they had forgotten that promise. They promised they weren't going to tie themselves in with those who were of a different faith, that were not going to help them serve Jehovah. And they'd made a promise, but they hadn't kept that, and the results were devastating. Here is what, again, Nehemiah notices. In those days, I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them were able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. I came back, and these people who had said, we're not going to take foreign wives anymore, this is too dangerous, it just corrupts our hearts, our spiritual hearts, we're not going to do that any longer. He says, I came back, and I find they've taken all these foreign wives, but not only have they taken foreign wives, their kids don't even speak the right language. How can they praise God when they can't even understand the message of God? I wonder what went through Nehemiah's heart when he came back. I wonder what he processed. You know, he left and there was the sound of rejoicing echoing from the city of Jerusalem. That's what he left, and he came back and he finds this entire spiritual focus has been depleted. Do you think he might have thought, what a waste of 12 years. You know, I gave these people the best 12 years of my life trying to help them get situated with God, and now look at what's happened. I don't know what he thought. I suspect he thought much of what you and I would think if we were in that same situation. But what I do know is what's revealed in chapter 13. We're going to end this book witnessing a Nehemiah that is going to demonstrate his finest qualities at this moment in history. The people have neglected God, but the persistence, the perseverance of God's grace is going to make Nehemiah a better man at this point than he was when he started. And folks, we can glean so much from him. He does not engage in self-pity. He does not make the failures of other people his personal responsibility. He doesn't take them as a slam against his efforts. He knows it's always been God's grace that's been involved in the whole process. He does not harbor animosity. He is not revolted by these people who have now fallen from where they once were. He recognizes that the work of rebuilding people is a never-ending work. You can rebuild a wall easily, but rebuilding people is a never-ending process. Nehemiah knows that. He understands that what was done yesterday has to be repeated today. And when you work with people, that's exactly the truth. What was done yesterday has to be repeated today. As a matter of fact, all you have to do if you are a parent is to remember parenting. And what was done yesterday has to be repeated today. Okay? And as they get older, the repetition maybe varies a little bit, but what was done yesterday still has to happen today. Why? Because we just don't stay there very long. We just don't remember those lessons very well. And Nehemiah knew that. So what does Nehemiah do? He starts over. He starts over. He rolls up his sleeves. He looks at these people, and he says, this is not what God's grace wants these people to be. So we need to get something else done. We need to tackle something. Specifically, he begins to deal with the crumbled children of the Creator. Not crumbled walls this time. The walls have stood faithfully for 12 years. It's the people who have lost their ability to stand. So what's he going to do? Number one, he confronts them with their sin. He confronts them with their sin. The first sign that we find of that in chapter 13 and verse 7 is that he says giving this room to Tobiah was an evil thing. Was an evil thing. Also, we find that he rebukes the people for not giving their tithes. Why is the house of God being neglected? He says in verse 11. In his confrontation of sin, he also rebukes the corruption of the Sabbath. What is this wicked thing you are doing? He says, desecrating the Sabbath day. Labels this as sin, confronts it as sin. He also rebuked them for marrying their foreigners. Now I want you to notice this verse. This shows you the quality of man that Nehemiah has become. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men and pulled out their hair. Who do you suppose he beat? I suspect it was folks not willing to listen. He's rebuking them for this sin. They haven't followed through with their promise. And I imagine there's somebody, that's got some big, long excuse. And Nehemiah gives them the gibs on the back of the head. Grabs a little hair while he's there. You know better than that. He's confronting their wrongdoing. But not only does he confront, he also goes through and makes sure that things get corrected. First up, Tobiah is out. He's cleared out of his room in the temple, and Nehemiah says, okay, it's time now to take the tithes, and we need to bring those and put them in that storehouse. We need to get the Levites back to work. They need to be serving where they're supposed to be serving. It needs to happen. He also takes this Sabbath day and he says, we're going to reinstitute this Sabbath. There's going to be quiet and rest on the Sabbath day. That's what God had expected us to do. This intermarriage thing, again, he presents this, and the people now vow that they're going to avoid those foreign marriages. They again see the danger and they say, we're not going to do that anymore. From where did this man of grace get that kind of motivation? How did he deal with the frustration? What was it that goaded him to confront people with their sin and to go the extra mile to help correct that sin so that the grace of God could once again be that in which these people lived and thrived? What put him to be able to do that again? Well, first, he knew the difference between right and wrong. He knew the difference between right and wrong. Folks, we have a standard. It's not the U.S. Constitution. It's not a group of lawmakers. It's not judges. It's not whoever is living in the White House. This is the standard. This is the standard. And if we are concerned about pleasing men, then we are not going to please God. And we need to be concerned about the standard of God. Nehemiah knew what was right and what was wrong. And it did not matter what even the people of God chose to do. He knew the difference between right and wrong. He called evil things evil. For Nehemiah, it was not the fickleness of people that were the issue that he had to deal with. It was the matter of right and wrong and good and evil. He saw something bigger than people's mistakes at work here. Good, evil, right, and wrong. Secondly, the man of grace kept in mind who it was that he was trying to please. He kept in mind who he was trying to please. He was more concerned about pleasing God than pleasing people. In the course of time, Nehemiah already had made enemies. And if we look through the book of Nehemiah, we will find that almost every enemy he ever made, he made because he was willing to do what was right. Isn't that fascinating? You make enemies by doing what was right. So how is he able to persist and to keep on? He keeps on because it's not a matter of receiving the acceptance of people. I'm not trying to please people. He says, I'm trying to please God. 3 times in chapter 13, Nehemiah offers up a prayer. And these prayers reveal how strongly focused he was on his desire to please God. Notice these 3 times. The first is in verse 14. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. God, remember me for this. I'll make enemies of people. I'll stand up for what's right. I'll correct sin. I'll call sin. I'll do all of this, but God, I need for you to remember me for doing this. Doesn't care what anybody else thinks. But God, I want you to remember me. Verse 22, remember me for this also, O my God, and show mercy to me according to your great love. Remember, God, that I'm wanting to please you above all else. Remember me for this and give me your mercy. And then the last verse in the book of Nehemiah. Remember me with favor, O my God. Nehemiah knew who he was trying to please. This book begins and ends centered upon the man of grace. Why does he bother? Why not give up? It's only one answer. Nehemiah knew that people could be fickle, but God is not. Nehemiah knew that people fail, but God does not. And he had so experienced the grace of God that he could keep on when the temptation may have been to have stopped. It is not permanent restoration that Nehemiah desired. Becky and I and Cammie, as a baby, infant, moved to Minneapolis. And Glenn was just a great mentor. Such a heart, such a person of grace. But one of Glenn's pet peeves, and this would have been several years ago, was the principle of trying to restore the church. You know, and we're part of a restoration movement. And Glenn said, you know, what comes to my mind when I think of restoring? He says, you just take this old thing and you repaint it and you redecorate it and you get it all fixed up and you step back and say, there it is. It's restored. That's not what needs to happen to the Lord's kingdom. He said the Lord's kingdom needs to be propagated. He said, so we need to be involved in the propagation movement. We're trying to take the church that the Lord built and bring it into our time and to make it alive and living, not just to restore something the way it once was. And as a youngster, I soaked that up. I thought, hey, that's pretty good. Well, you know what? That's the same thing that Nehemiah is doing. Nehemiah knows it's not about just getting things fixed up nice. That doesn't get the job done. He works with people who fail. He labors for them because he knows there's an unfailing Father. And he strives harder to please the Father than he does the people. Nehemiah labors with one objective, and that is for God to remember him. As we are concluding this segment of our grace study this year, I think it's a valid question. How do you want God to remember you? Now, we've covered a number of things, and I haven't spoken directly, but I trust that God's given us minds that we can understand. I mean, you can evaluate. We've talked about today, for example, if we've forgotten who our enemy is and gotten comfortable with sin and made room for our sin in our life, it's time to clean house. It's time to kick somebody out. And I think we understand that the evil one has many schemes, but we need not give him the room of comfort in our hearts. I think most of us can apply that, comprehend that. Will God remember you as a promise keeper, as a promise breaker? These people had made some promises. Said, God, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to do. In the course of time, they stopped fulfilling those promises. Will God remember me as one who is a keeper or a breaker? Will he remember you as one who takes spiritual rebuke as an encouragement to step back into his grace experience? Now, the reason Nehemiah rebuked the sin and went about what he knew would try to correct that sinfulness was not because he was a mean, harsh man. He was the most grace-filled man that I've ever read about in Scripture. And he knew that people needed the grace experience to live by, that sin wouldn't satisfy. There is not a sin that will make us whole. He knew. And so he confronts that sin. The amazing thing is apparently the people chose to listen to that. Again, the persistence of God's grace. Do we need to step away from something in our life? Are we steadfast because our desire is to please God regardless of how others choose to react? Are we steadfast? How will God remember you? This book of Nehemiah, I think, gives us just innumerable challenges in this grace experience. How do you want right now, today, God to remember you? Do you need to engage in some grace living, some life changes? God's grace is persistent. He hasn't given up. He still holds his hands open. He still is the Father waiting for the prodigal to come down the road. God has not given up on anyone. Don't give up.